So obviously you guys know what happened in Lincoln County. I'll touch on it, but I guess my insights might be more insightful on what happened at the state level, but certainly going to talk about some of the things that you saw in Lincoln County. So you can go to the next screen. So, of course, we heard mention of a red wave, and as I say up there, it's pretty clear that Republicans made gains in D.C. With between the White House and controlling both chambers of Congress. But when you look across the country, Republicans actually their success was more measured. They actually didn't flip that many state houses, state house chambers. So it actually was a pretty flat nationwide for both parties. Here in Maine, I've been kind of thinking of it as kind of a rising tide. I guess maybe you'd call it a red tide, because Republicans definitely did pick up numerous seats in the legislature. But Democrats are retaining control of the House and the Senate, but they'll do it by smaller majorities, which politically means that it's going to be potentially tougher for them to get their legislative agenda done, and it's going to be a little bit tougher for Governor Janet Mills to get her agenda done in the next 2 years. So, it's Republicans definitely made significant gains here in Maine, not significant number-wise, but they made incursions into areas where they have been growing in the past couple of years. So, we're seeing that divide more and more in Maine between rural and urban, and that certainly played out here this year that we saw in past years as well. Go to the next page. So here we're talking about control of the Maine legislature. So currently, Democrats have a 12-person majority in the House. They have a 13-person majority in the Senate. What it looks like now is Democrats will have 77 seats, Republicans will have 72, and there are 2 independents, both of which lean more towards the Democrats. So it looks like Democrats will still retain control of the House, but again, it'll be by a smaller majority. In the Senate, same story. Republicans picked up 2 seats, so now it's a 20-15 split. I should say those are unofficial, and you'll see that there are actually recount races in both, and I'll touch on them in a little bit. But there are actually 9 recount races in the House and 2 in the Senate. A lot of those won't change. There's actually 1 that's tied right now in southern Maine. But a lot of those probably won't change, because when you have recounts, we don't usually see the outcome change. But some of those margins are pretty small. So those majorities and minority numbers probably going to change by the time this all gets finished up. And we have so many recounts, plus we have the ranked choice tabulation going on in 2nd District right now, that actually the recounts are going to go pretty much all the way to Thanksgiving. And because they can only do 2 a day for legislative recounts typically. So they've scheduled them out through the 25th, and they need to get them done because the legislature needs to certify the results so the legislature can come in and the new legislature can be seated. So it'll be probably by the end of the month before we know exactly what the landscape looks like in the legislature. So, next slide. So Lincoln County races. You guys are all familiar with this at this point, but in District 45, that was vacant after the resignation of Democratic representative, but Republicans managed to pick it up this time. 46, Representative Crafts won again. 47, as Mr. Farron managed to flip that from Republican to Democrat. 48, Representative Stover managed to hold on to that as well by a pretty comfortable margin. District 53 talked about, Judy Tunkel, unfortunately, she didn't succeed against Representative Lemelin. He'll be going back again, despite the fact that Representative Lemelin, I cover the state house, so he's made some controversial comments in the past, but that's a tough district, just politically speaking for Democrats right now, as I'm sure you all know. And District 62, same thing. Pretty rural area of Maine, includes parts of Kennebec County, and Republicans will keep control of that. And Representative Katrina Smith, she will actually be the assistant minority leader in the House this coming year. So next page. And then I'm sure from your guys' perspective, that looks better. Democrats are defended two Senate seats. And the District 24 seat, former Representative Tepler will be going back. She defeated former Representative Jeff Pierce to keep that in Democratic hands. So that was kind of status quo in the Senate side. Okay, next page. Yep, next page. So these are the recounts. As I mentioned, there are 11 different recounts going on, and I tried to show kind of what the vote differences are there. So as I mentioned, right now the Maine Senate is 20 Democrats and 15 Republicans. It looks like they're probably pretty safe as far as those numbers, but you can see, especially the District 8 race, and this is Northern Penobscot County. Senator Mike Tipping, he lives in Orono, so that's like basically, we'll see a map later, but it's Orono up kind of towards the east, towards the west, very rural area. That's a hard district, I think, for Republicans to hold on to. It's historically been Democratic, but I think that's one of those districts that we're seeing across the state where Republicans are making inroads, and it's becoming more and more difficult for Democrats to hold on to. But Mike Tipping has held on to it. Looks like he's held on to it, but it's only 117 votes.
Kevin, I'm sorry, can you tell us what triggers a recount?
Sure. So Maine actually does not have an automatic recount provision. So a campaign actually has to request a recount. And any campaign can request a recount, but the difference is it has to be in a certain margin for the state to pay for it. And in this case, I think in legislative races, it has to be within 1.5% before the state will essentially pay for it. They say you have to put up a deposit, but if it's within 1.5%, you don't have to put that deposit down, and the state ends up picking it up. But that's kind of a point of confusion. In fact, the Austin, Ontario campaign in 2nd District, they were saying initially that this should trigger an automatic recount. Maine doesn't have automatic recounts. They have to actually formally request them. So all these races, you'll see some of them are pretty close. So looking at the House races, District 44, that's a pretty big spread. And of course, that's just east of here in Hope, Union, and Warren. That's a pretty big spread. I think it was about 7%. So in that case, I think the Republican who's challenging it, Ray Thoms, he probably would have to pay for it if he ends up losing. And that's a lot of votes to overturn when you're only talking about 5,000 votes total. So to overcome 362 a vote gap, that seemed kind of unlikely, but I haven't seen those results either. So I don't know whether he knows there's some discrepancy there that he's pointing out. Same thing going over. So 10 Democrats, or Democrat in District 75 has a 10 vote margin. That's obviously pretty close. That's in Chesterville and Farmington. 52, which is just down there, next county over. 16 votes, again, pretty close. District 81 is 19 votes in favor of the Republican. District 58, which is Belgrade area, that's 44 votes, a little bit bigger. And then we're going over to Lewiston, that's 36 votes. Again, a little bit bigger, but I can't remember what the it's tough to flip votes when you're talking about that many. Only 5,000 votes. Because you guys have probably all worked at the polls. The accounts tend to be pretty accurate, but it does change. So some of these are pretty tight margins. You can go over to the next page. Then again, District 98, Bowdoin, Durham, Pownell, Topsom area, that's a 54 vote margin. Going down to District 142, that's a 64 vote margin in Sanford and Springvale. But of course, the one that lots of people are going to be paying attention to is District 141, where the votes are actually tied. It's 2,476 to 2,476. And those are the official numbers that the Secretary of State gets reported to. So that's not those that are being reported in the media, although we like to get everything correct. We don't get the official counts. We're necessarily get the official counts, but the Secretary of State does. So that race is actually tied. And that one is interesting because you may have read there was news coverage of the incumbent Republican, Lucas Lanigan. He was accused of some domestic violence. He was actually arrested. He's disputed that, but that came out right before the election. But despite that, we're looking at a tied race there. So I think there'll be a lot of attention on that race. What's the tiebreaker? Actually, that's a great question. I think it's a fishbowl, draw out of the fishbowl, right? Is it a special election? House seat. Okay, there you go. See, I learned something tonight too. So yeah, special election, huh?
Isn't ranked choice
6
voting
weeks.
involved
Okay,
in
so
this?
so that was from Mr. Farron was saying that there's actually a special election and a tiebreaker. Okay, all right. So in about 6 weeks, if their votes don't change, and I would think that it might change, one or two votes. Yeah. So that's another seat that we may not know an outcome from until next year. Okay, next page. And so I just threw these up here just to, we often hear about the divide between rural and more urban Maine. This is the current outlook as it looks right now. The left is the House of Representatives and the right is the Senate. So you can see there's a lot of red throughout the state. And then there's only a little bit of blue along the coast. And then the same thing in the Senate. And of course, that's where our populated areas. So we're continuing to see that trend here in Maine of the populated areas leaning blue, leaning left, the more Republican areas and conservative and rural areas leaning conservative. And that big kind of blue splotch in the Senate, that's Senate District 8. That's one of the races that's the subject of a recount right now. Okay. These are the presidential races. I know it's hard to see from so far away, but you can still see. So I put these up for between 2020 and 2024. And you can just see the subtle differences that we're seeing in Maine that we're seeing across the country, most notably Aroostook County. So in 2020, there were a number of towns that went for Joe Biden. In 2024, all of Aroostook County went for Donald Trump. Same thing, heading out towards Washington County, you still had a little bit more blue. Western Maine still had a little bit more blue. But then along the coast, it's just a solid blue line, except for, I guess, Friendship, Waldoboro area near you guys. But it's just a solid blue line. And this is the last slide, and then we can get to questions. So we talked about at the beginning about the kind of the red wave that we saw across the country, or some folks are referring to as a red wave. But things definitely in Maine are different than what we saw nationally. So Trump narrowed the margin in Maine between 2020 and 2024, but he still lost the state by more than 50,000 votes nationwide, and that's according to unofficial results. But then if you look at those some of those battleground states, and I just put 3 of them up there. So he lost all these states in 2020, but he won these in 2024. In Pennsylvania, it was 142,000 votes that he won by this year. Georgia, 117,000. Wisconsin, 29,000. So that's kind of shows that what the differences that we saw nationally as far as the politics didn't necessarily play out here. We did see what I was calling kind of the more rising tide here of, Republicans are definitely making inroads, and but not as big inroads, at least in the presidential election here in Maine as we saw in other states. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that. And since you guys are on the ground from the Democratic side, you can probably shed light for me on what's going on and what you're hearing and seeing. And I think that's the last slide I had.
We have one question already from Zoom. He is wondering, are these gains due to any extent to an influx of funding from groups outside of Maine, or whose sources of funding are, shall he say, murky?
As far as gains from on the Republican side?
That's, I believe, asking yes.
I mean, I think that probably what we saw here in Maine is pretty reflective of what we saw nationwide, that this year, especially because of the economy, Donald Trump's message just resonated with people more so than Kamala Harris. And that's just a challenge that Democrats nationwide have faced. I mean, there certainly were there was campaign messaging here in Maine that was pretty reflective of the campaign messaging we saw nationally from both parties, not just the Republican Party. Republicans were focusing on the economy, immigration, some of the hardcore social issues here on the Democratic side. A lot of us talking about abortion. So I think I didn't see any major incursions of. There was a lot of outside spending in Maine this year, especially in the congressional race and some of the state house races. But I didn't see anything typically very unusual from past years. So I think it was just more reflective of kind of what we're seeing nationwide.
And how will
But
the
that's just my speculation.
well, and do we know yet how the passage of referendum question number 1, which is going to limit outside spending to some degree, do we know yet how that might affect future races?
Yeah, it's unclear. I mean, the big question there is whether question 1 was the ballot question that would limit contributions to super PACs to $5,000 from individuals and from groups. This was pursued by an out-of-state group that hopes to actually put this issue before the U.S. Supreme Court. They see this as an issue that's ripe for a challenge to an aspect of Citizens United. It's not Citizens United itself. It's a side kind of issue that didn't get decided by the Supreme Court after Citizens United. But they want to put this before it because they say these super PACs are basically ways for wealthy donors on all sides, not just on either side of the one party, to potentially, they're not supposed to coordinate with with the campaigns they're supposedly supporting. They're supposed to be independent expenditures, but you get a millionaire or a billionaire that gives a whole bunch of money on an issue that is important to that person, and then that elected politician ends up voting that way. So it's the classic quid pro quo. So kind of to your point, it's not clear when we might see some changes. That the full expectation and actually the plan of the group that put on question 1 was to have this challenged in court. They actually want to take Maine's case to the U.S. Supreme Court. They tried it in Massachusetts. The courts blocked it there. They tried it in Alaska. It didn't succeed, but they see that because of Maine's campaign finance laws and because of Maine voters' history of supporting these kinds of measures, they said Maine's the place we're going to do it. And sure enough, it was 70%, 70% that supported it. So it'll probably be a couple of years because I imagine it'll be challenged pretty quickly.
If you have a question, raise your hand in the room and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
Just on this, who is like they that you're referring to, that they want to bring it to the Supreme Court? Who's the they?
Oh, sure. Who's the
Yeah.
group? So it's interesting. There's it's a Harvard law professor that started it, and I'm not going to remember the name of his organization. I can look it up and tell folks afterwards. But it's a group out of Massachusetts that was spearheaded by a Harvard law professor named Professor Lessig, and they're just active on national campaign finance. You remember the name of it?
Oh, come on. This is the most
I was just wondering on the state of Jared Golden's race.
Yeah, so they're still doing the ranked choice voting tabulation. I was watching it today. It looks like they've gotten through most of the counties, and I'm thinking that perhaps I didn't see the end where they would get an indication of when they would do the actual tabulation. They were still scanning, and mostly scanning ballots is the part that takes time. So it might happen tomorrow, I'm thinking. And at this point, both campaigns have kind of been involved and they're flagging potential issues, but it didn't sound like there's been any major issues that have come up during the process so far. So we might get a result on that, on the ranked choice tabulation tomorrow or Saturday. And then it sounds like if the outcome doesn't change and if Golden still wins, that the Terrio campaign would probably ask for a hand recount. And that would take even more time because so the legislative races recounts, they're done by hand. The legislative races, they can do 2 a day. Now with a CD2, we're talking about 400,000 ballots counted by hand. So that will take weeks probably.
Let's see. What is ranked choice tabulation? Each candidate's votes get recounted. I'm not quite sure that I'm understanding.
telling just a general explanation of the ranked choice
Yeah.
process. So as you know, people who decide to use when you go into the ballot, you can choose to rank your candidates first choice, second choice, third choice. On the first vote count, you're only counting the first choice. If nobody gets above 50% on the first choice, then then it has to go to ranked choice tabulation. And when that happens, they start from the bottom up, and basically they eliminate the last or the lower candidates, and they look to see whether the people who supported that candidate indicated anyone as their second and third choice. And so if that person's supporters put someone else down as their second choice, that vote would then go to one of the other candidates. So in this case, it would go to Golden or to Terrio. In this case, it's really interesting, and you guys probably heard this already, but this case, the only reason this is a ranked choice election is because we had a declared write-in candidate, Diana Miranda from Surrey. She only got 420 votes out of 400,000 that were cast. But there were 12,000 people who either left the ballot blank or wrote in a different candidate. And because this was a ranked choice election and because nobody got over 50%, that now requires a ranked choice tabulation. So it's actually those 12,000 blank ballots that are going to decide the election. There's a possibility that people, whether as a protest vote against either candidate, left the first choice blank and then put in their second choice. It sounds like most people are expecting that's not a lot of people, so that's why it looks like Jared Golden is probably pretty safe, because right now Austin Terrio is trailing by 2,000 votes, 2,100 votes. He'd have to make up a lot of ground. He'd have to pick up a lot of blank votes, or people who wrote in other candidates, wrote in Mickey Mouse or their mom or whoever, and then put a second choice down in order for him to get past Jared Golden. And the other interesting, and getting into the weeds here, the other interesting, once you do that, so if nobody filled in a first oval and nobody filled in a second oval, they left the whole thing blank, that ballot gets eliminated. That then reduces the total pool of ballots. So right now, Jared Golden's at 48.6%, and I think they're about a half percentage difference between the two of them. Once you eliminate a whole bunch of ballots that nobody actually voted in, the pool shrinks. So that alone could lift Jared Golden over 50%.
Question. He is asking if ranked choice voting is involved with the race that is tied in the state house. And the answer to that question, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, would be no,
Yeah.
because we do not have ranked choice voting for state general election races.
Yeah, that's right. So we only have ranked choice voting in primary elections for the legislature or for governor, but because of Maine's constitution, we don't have ranked choice voting for state elections in the general election. We only have it in the federal elections for Congress or president.
So Kevin, I have a question asking you to put look into your future, your crystal ball here a little bit. And now with the legislature the way it is and governor in her last term, what do you think happens in the legislature? How do you think this plays out a little bit?
I think it's going to be a tough fight for both parties, and you would hope, well, I would hope as a reporter, kind of tries to stay out of the politics of it, just covers the politics, that would lead to compromise and negotiations, because with such small margins, especially on hot button issues, you're going to lose votes on both sides. So Democrats are not going to be able to push through, like some of the gun measures that passed this past year after the Lewiston shootings. They passed by 3 votes, or in the Senate, they passed by 1 vote. You're not going to have that margin this year. So if you get an issue, especially guns, a social issue, abortion, that there are more conservative or moderate Democrats that don't necessarily vote with their party, you're going to lose them. So Republicans definitely have more power this time around. So I think you're going to see probably a lot more fighting, but hopefully, I would hope, more negotiation. And in my opinion, that probably strengthens the governor's hand a little bit more. She frequently has kind of come in as a negotiator, try to work as the middle ground moderate. So I think we might see that in cases where she supports the issue. In cases where she doesn't support the issue, she just wants it to go away, then she might side with whichever party is on her side.
We have another question from Zoom. Her question is, the Republicans canvass in Maine? They didn't seem to have a ground game nationally, but it didn't seem to matter. Is there analysis on canvassing in the age of social media?
Yeah, Republicans definitely had a very aggressive get out the vote canvassing effort this year, and I think that's part of the reason why they attribute their successes in calling back some of the state house seats. I think that they recognized, they're still, after the Obama years, as you guys know, Democrats did so well on that. Republicans have tried to replicate that in their own way. So they had a very, very aggressive canvassing campaign, and I think that shows in a lot of the state house races. Sure. So the question was, looking ahead to 2 years from now, given what we just went through, kind of what does that mean for the elections that we're going to have here in Maine? Governor's race, Senate, U.S. Senate race. We're going to have another race in the 2nd district. And of course, the state house race is kind of what that means. I think probably, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it means, other than the state is like that the slides showed, the state is becoming more polarized in between rural and coastal areas. The coastal areas are growing faster than the rural areas, but at the same time, some of the rural areas that went Democratic in the past are now going Republican, even though they seem to be holding their population. So, as far as what's going to happen 2 years from now, I think you guys probably know better than I do who the folks are that are potentially being mentioned for running for governor. I think it's going to be I expect this going to be a really robust debate since Mills is termed out. There are a lot of names that I hear, people potentially eyeing it. And a lot of well-known names. I don't know who's going to win. Republicans and I think Republicans have probably a lot of candidates too. They don't have as deep of a high-profile people in high-profile positions. But I would say for the Republican Party, they actually have quite a few young candidates that are in the state house. Like if you look at the Republican leadership in the state house right now, it's fairly young. And so Republicans are kind of building their bench down low, and there's some folks who are not in leadership positions that are doing a lot in the Republican Party. So we all remember the race for Susan Collins' seat 4 years ago. We're going to do that again in 2 years if Collins runs. She hasn't said which way or whether she will. Oh, she did not say. Okay, so we'll have that contest again. The next 2 years could be interesting for Susan Collins with Trump in the White House. So we'll see where she lands. She's, you guys probably heard the coverage some of the coverage that she's in line to be the chair of the Appropriations Committee. And the Appropriations Committee is one of the most powerful positions in all of Congress. That's the committees that hold the purse strings. This has been Susan Collins, one of her goals for years. And she is now in line to be the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And that just objectively could benefit Maine because the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, their state tends to get a lot of money. They can direct a lot of money to their state. But the big question here is because Senator Mitch McConnell is stepping down as minority, well, now majority leader, he could potentially kind of Bigfoot her and take that position from her. So far it looks like we're not sure if that's going to happen. I know she's hopes to stay on as appropriations chair. So it might be interesting to see the next 2 years under the Trump presidency and under the new Republican leadership in the Senate.
Yeah, I don't know if this is something that's in your area of expertise or knowledge, or maybe somebody else in the audience who's actually in the legislature, but there was an editorial in the Press Herald saying that basically the budget is really in trouble for the next biennial because there's all these unfunded needs for the general fund, for the highway fund, and that it amounts to, $1.5 billion or something like that, but they actually have to come up with more funds. And so I'm wondering if anybody has any knowledge of how that might impact the work of the Democratic majority.
Yeah, I'll give my kind of my take from what I see just 30,000 foot kind of watching it nonpartisan, but certainly our revenue stream is flattening out, it seems to be, and that's been the projection all along, is that the state's revenue stream would flatten. And that's why Governor Millis has been saying that she's been trying to she's pushed back on some of the more aggressive spending proposals that came out of her own party in the legislature. But we still have a pretty large surplus, close to $1 billion. The Republicans were pushing that we're headed for kind of a big fiscal cliff. I'll let some of the folks in the legislature who deal with this, speak to that. But it's certainly the revenues are flattening or declining.
So I think, and you can think back over the last biennium, but it makes a great soundbite. But the truth is, and Chris Johnson can attest, that before we even have established our budget, even though the budget is in process always, we haven't brought forward any of the unspent money, that we haven't swept those accounts and brought them in. So when they put that article in there, it was very timely, because we're in the middle of races and you want to tell people, look, those Democrats spent so much money, now we've got $1 billion deficit. Well, we haven't really brought all the money forward yet, and we haven't really completed the budget yet. That will happen, very early. But I would say, hold on, because I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And we will bring forward that money, the unspent money, the unallocated unspent, and there's some unobligated. We won't have the ARPA money. That's something we already knew. We won't have that going forward. But we have some, there will be some to fill. And we always knew, we've known for a while, that this was going to be the session, the year. The 132nd was when we were going to start to realize some of these things. But it isn't over yet. And I think that the gloom and doom report really tied to the election cycle, in my opinion. And I think it'll be better news when we get it put down on paper. That's my hope.
But I think the kind of the reality is that at least the governor is projecting that her budgets are probably going to be, I don't want to use the word fiscally conservative, but she may not be proposing as many new spending initiatives as we've seen in the past, because the revenues are not where they have been. And the federal money is kind of drying up, the ARPA money.
So let's take a question from the chat here. Kevin, you're a State House reporter, but maybe you have some thoughts on this. Is of Trump's nominees so far, particularly the more controversial ones, will they all get confirmed?
Yeah. I worked in DC very briefly and for about 2 years, and during the Obama years, and remember some fairly heated nomination fights, but nothing like I'm sure we're going to see now. Folks like Matt Gaetz, that's getting a lot of attention. I imagine that not all of them are going to get confirmed. This is just totally me speaking from watching it from afar and kind of reading it, but certainly folks like Gaetz, and now we saw a nomination of RFK Jr. to be the head of the Health and Human Services Committee. There's going to be folks in both parties that are raising concerns about that, and that's where we're going to see folks like Susan Collins, who's a fairly moderate Republican. Folks here may disagree with that, but I would describe her as a fairly moderate Republican, and she's her, Lisa Murkowski, some of the other kind of middle of the road Republicans are going to play a big role in some of these nomination fights, I would imagine. But I don't think he's talked about either doing recess appointments or using constitutional clause to basically go around the Senate, but I don't think the Senate's ready to give up its control entirely.
So my question is around what's going to happen with the national budget, and if the policies that Trump has claimed he's going to implement happen and our national economy's in the toilet, what will that do to Maine politics and the likelihood of various people or parties winning in the next cycle?
I can't quite speak to what
cycle.
to what that will mean for Maine. I can say, we're probably going to be seeing some changes. So right now, a lot of our renewable energy policies are based on Biden administration policies, initiatives. That money is probably going to either dry up or decrease. So we will see decreases in in programs that were promoted during the Biden administration, I'm sure. There might be increases in other programs coming from the Trump administration. I'm not sure, so I'm afraid I can't comment. We are, as a state, we certainly are dependent on federal resources for a lot of things. You know, certainly Medicare for our senior population and Medicaid. So any changes to that, and certainly any changes to Social Security would have a huge impact on Maine, given our aging demographics. So it's kind of all to be determined, I think.
Okay. My question's back a little bit to how this election worked and the potential for the future, particularly looking in 2 years. From some of the canvassing, it seemed at times we ran into people who are in a different information ecosystem. You know, you want to talk about something, they want to talk in terms that showed they were definitely getting their information, their facts, quote unquote, from someplace else. And there was, personally, I found it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to break through. And it gave me, as going over time, more and more doors, it seemed as if there were really at least 2 different ecosystems. Do you see that from where you sit?
Yeah, as somebody who's in the news media, the misinformation that's out there and the disinformation is extremely disheartening. I mean, I've been doing this is my profession, you know. But I know we get a bad rap in the media. Nobody likes us. We've sometimes ranked below Congress as far as trustworthiness, which just kills me. You know, to think that, you know, as much as people disdain Congress, they trust the media less. But you know, it's really frustrating to see that, and it's so hard to counter disinformation now. And it's not just from one side; it's from all sides. I'll say, you know, as a you know, kind of try to be nonpartisan reporter, I see disinformation coming from the left and the right. Social media makes it really hard right now, and I think that's the challenge that all of us in the media face. You know, working in newspapers for years, I saw the decline in circulation and kind of as everything went online, but now everybody can get their news from whatever source they want. And I'll be honest, the social media networks don't look at the media. They're not our friends, they're our competitors. Facebook doesn't want you to jump off of Facebook to go to Maine Public's website or to Press Herald's website. They want you to stay on Facebook. So they want you to get your information from there. And just the blatant disinformation campaigns are really discouraging and really hard. Yeah, you guys were out on the streets, so I'm sure you have a different perspective talking to folks. But it's hard to counter that. And as a member of the media, it's really disheartening. But it's not something you want to give up on. So, and it's unfortunate because it's leading to unenlightened voters on all sides. And you know, as a reporter who's kind of spent most of my years working on elections and trying to educate people about, in a nonpartisan way, about elections, to see them relying on disinformation is really disheartening.
Okay, that was a joke in the room. I think what Kevin just crystallized for all of us is the importance of the fourth estate, the press, the media. Full disclosure, I'm a reporter too, medical reporter. So I want to give a huge round of applause to Kevin for joining us tonight and for doing the work of journalism. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.